Sarah Mitchell pulled into the parking lot of Thunder Valley Shooting Range, her hands gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter than usual. 3 months had passed since she left the military, and the transition to civilian life felt like trying to fit into clothes that no longer belonged to her. The familiar weight of her service pistol in its case brought both comfort and painful memories of the life she'd left behind. The shooting range buzzed with weekend activity. Groups of friends laughed loudly as they compared their targets, while seasoned shooters moved with practiced precision between lanes. Sarah kept her head down as she approached the counter, hoping to blend into the background. Her short-cropped brown hair and modest civilian clothes gave no hint of the extraordinary woman beneath the surface. "First time here, sweetheart?" The range officer, a heavy-set man named Rick, barely looked up from his clipboard. His tone carried that familiar condescension Sarah had encountered too often since leaving the service. "We got beginner packages if you need some basic instruction. A lot of ladies find our introductory course real helpful." Sarah simply nodded and paid for lane time, ammunition, and eye protection. She'd learned that explaining her background often led to disbelief or unwanted attention. Better to let her shooting do the talking, though today she planned to keep things deliberately average. Standing out had become something she actively avoided. At lane 15, she unpacked her gear methodically. The Sig Sauer P320 felt familiar in her hands, like greeting an old friend after a long absence. She loaded the magazine with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over despite months away from regular training. The weight distribution, the grip texture, the trigger pull, everything came flooding back in an instant. 3 lanes over, a group of 4 men in their 30s were making quite a show of their shooting session. They wore tactical gear that looked fresh from the store, complete with patches and accessories that screamed weekend warrior. Their leader, a tall guy with a perfectly groomed beard named Marcus, was holding court with stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. So there I was, 300 yards out, wind picking up. Marcus gestured dramatically while his friends hung on every word. One-shot center mass. The instructor said it was the best shooting he'd seen from a civilian. His audience nodded appreciatively, clearly impressed by tales of tactical training courses and military-style exercises. Sarah tried to focus on her own shooting, but their voices carried across the indoor range. She set up at the 7-yard line, a respectable distance for handgun practice. Her first magazine went downrange steadily, each shot deliberate and controlled. The grouping was good, better than most recreational shooters achieved, but not exceptional enough to draw attention. "Check out the new girl," one of Marcus's friends. Danny nudged the others and nodded toward Sarah. "Bet she's never held anything more dangerous than a nail gun." The comment drew snickers from the group, though they kept their voices low enough to maintain plausible deniability. Sarah reloaded and continued shooting, her jaw tightening slightly. She'd heard variations of these comments countless times. In the military, she'd faced skepticism until her performance spoke for itself. Here she was just another woman at the range, subject to assumptions and casual dismissal from men who'd never faced real combat. Marcus moved his target back to 25 yards and fired a magazine with theatrical flair. His shots scattered across the target in a loose pattern, but he examined the results with exaggerated satisfaction. "Not bad for someone who's had a few beers," he announced to his friends, though Sarah noticed he'd been nursing the same bottle for over an hour. The range safety officer made his rounds, checking on shooters and ensuring proper protocols. When he reached Sarah's lane, he paused to examine her target through binoculars. The grouping was tight and well-centered, showing clear evidence of proper training and regular practice. "Nice shooting," he said quietly, genuine respect in his voice. "You been doing this long?" Sarah shrugged non-committally. "A while," she replied, not wanting to elaborate. The safety officer nodded and moved on, but she noticed Marcus and his friends had overheard the exchange. Their casual dismissal shifted to mild curiosity, though their attitude remained unchanged. As Sarah prepared for her next string of fire, she couldn't help but overhear Marcus explaining the finer points of combat shooting to his audience. His knowledge was a mixture of half-truths and action movie mythology, peppered with terminology he'd picked up from YouTube videos and tactical gear catalogs. The key is aggressive stance. Marcus demonstrated an exaggerated lean forward that would throw off anyone's balance in actual combat. "You gotta dominate the weapon, show it who's boss. That's how they do it in special operations." Sarah bit back a smile at the misconceptions. Real combat shooting was about efficiency, accuracy, and staying alive, not looking impressive for an audience. The techniques Marcus described would get someone killed in actual combat, but pointing that out would only create problems she didn't need. The afternoon wore on with Marcus's group growing louder and more boastful with each magazine they fired. Their shooting remained mediocre at best, but their confidence seemed to increase inversely with their actual performance. Sarah continued her steady practice, methodically working through different distances and target types. As she packed up her gear, preparing to leave before the situation escalated into unwanted attention, Sarah noticed a familiar figure entering the range. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the distinctive bearing and confident stride of someone she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Colonel James Harrison, her former commanding officer, walked through the entrance with the same purposeful energy she remembered from their time together in some of the world's most dangerous places. Colonel Harrison scanned the range with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing tactical situations quickly. Even in civilian clothes, his military bearing was unmistakable. His gray hair was shorter than regulation required, and his casual polo shirt couldn't hide the evidence of decades maintaining peak physical condition. Sarah felt a mix of emotions seeing him here: pride, nostalgia, and a touch of anxiety about her current circumstances. Marcus and his crew immediately noticed the newcomer's commanding presence. There was something about Harrison that made people instinctively straighten up, even when they didn't understand why. His confident stride and alert eyes suggested someone comfortable with authority and dangerous situations. "Wonder if that guy's military," Danny whispered to Marcus, who was already sizing up the potential competition. Marcus had built his reputation at the range partly on being the most tactically knowledgeable shooter present, and he didn't appreciate challenges to that status. Sarah tried to finish packing quickly, hoping to slip out before Harrison spotted her. Their last conversation had been difficult, him trying to convince her to extend her service, her explaining why she needed to return to civilian life. The wounds from her final deployment were still fresh, both physical and emotional, and she wasn't ready to face reminders of what she'd left behind. But Harrison's trained eye caught movement in his peripheral vision, and he turned toward Sarah's lane. Their eyes met across the range, and she saw instant recognition flash across his face. A genuine smile spread across his features, the kind reserved for soldiers who'd earned his deepest respect through shared hardship and exceptional performance. "Well, I'll be damned," Harrison said quietly to himself, but loud enough for nearby shooters to hear. He began walking purposefully towards Sarah's position, clearly pleased to see her again. Marcus intercepted Harrison's path, extending his hand with practiced charm. "Afternoon, sir." "Marcus Thompson. Couldn't help but notice you carry yourself like military. Active duty?" Harrison paused politely, his attention divided between Marcus and reaching Sarah. "Retired Army," he replied curtly, offering a brief handshake. "Colonel James Harrison." The title had immediate impact on Marcus's group. Colonel meant serious business, someone who'd commanded hundreds or thousands of soldiers. Marcus's chest puffed up slightly as he prepared to establish his own credentials with this impressive newcomer. "Outstanding, sir. I've done some tactical training myself. Advanced combat pistol courses, defensive shooting seminars. Always looking to learn from experienced military personnel." Marcus gestured toward his gear setup, hoping to impress the colonel with his equipment and apparent dedication to the shooting sports. Harrison nodded politely but continued moving toward Sarah, who was now trapped between wanting to disappear and knowing escape was impossible. She straightened unconsciously, falling into the posture drilled into her through years of military service. "Sergeant Mitchell," Harrison said warmly as he reached her lane, using her former rank with obvious affection and respect. "What brings you to this neck of the woods?" "Last I heard, you were settling somewhere up north." Sarah felt the familiar comfort of being recognized by someone who truly knew her capabilities. "Hello, Colonel. Just moved to the area recently. Thought I'd check out the local ranges, stay sharp." She gestured at her modest gear setup, hoping he wouldn't make too big a deal of their reunion. Marcus's ears perked up at the exchange. Sergeant didn't sound particularly impressive. He'd met plenty of former military personnel with that rank. Most were decent shooters, but nothing extraordinary. His confidence remained intact as he moved closer to eavesdrop on the conversation. "Still shooting that SIG?" Harrison asked, nodding at Sarah's pistol. I remember you could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 50 meters with that thing. Made the rest of us look like amateurs. His comment was casual, but Marcus caught the reference to 50 meters over 160 feet, which would be extraordinary accuracy for a handgun. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. That was a good day, sir. Wind was calm. Everything just came together. She downplayed the achievement, but Harrison's knowing look suggested he remembered the circumstances differently. That particular demonstration had been under combat conditions, with lives depending on her precision. Good day, my ass. Harrison chuckled. You were shooting through a window at hostile targets while taking incoming fire. I wrote you up for a commendation after that mission. He paused, studying her current setup. You keeping up with your training? Can't let those skills deteriorate. The conversation was drawing more attention now. Other shooters were glancing their way, curious about the discussion between the distinguished colonel and the quiet woman they'd barely noticed. Marcus positioned himself to better hear their exchange, his tactical gear suddenly feeling less impressive. Danny joined his friend, whispering urgently. Did he say 50 meters? With a pistol? That's gotta be bullshit, right? I mean, she looks like she works at a bank or something. Marcus studied Sarah more carefully now, looking for signs of the extraordinary shooter the colonel described. Her stance was correct but not showy. Her gear functional rather than expensive. Nothing about her appearance suggested elite military training or exceptional combat experience. I try to get out when I can, Sarah replied to Harrison's question. Different world out here, though. Lot more relaxed than what we were used to. She glanced meaningfully around the civilian range, hoping he'd understand her desire to keep things low-key. Harrison caught her meaning, but seemed to have other ideas. Relaxed is good, but you don't want to get rusty. Tell you what, why don't you show me what you're working on today? I'd love to see if you've maintained that legendary accuracy. Sarah felt trapped between her desire for anonymity and respect for her former commander. Refusing his request would seem rude and unusual, but demonstrating her true capabilities would shatter the careful invisibility she'd maintained since leaving the service. Marcus sensed an opportunity to showcase his own skills alongside whatever this sergeant might demonstrate. Mind if we watch? Always interested in seeing different shooting techniques. Maybe we could all learn something from each other. His suggestion carried an undertone of challenge, the kind of subtle competitiveness that emerged when alpha personalities encountered potential rivals. Marcus still assumed he was the superior shooter present, despite the colonel's obvious respect for Sarah's abilities. Harrison looked at Marcus with barely concealed amusement, recognizing the type from decades of military service. Every unit had soldiers who talked a better game than they played, and civilian tactical enthusiasts often exhibited similar traits, multiplied by lack of real-world testing. Of course, Harrison replied smoothly. I think you'll find Sergeant Mitchell's approach quite educational. He turned back to Sarah with an expression that mixed encouragement with gentle command authority. Come on, Sarah, just like old times. Show these gentlemen what real shooting looks like. Sarah realized she had no choice but to comply with the colonel's request. Years of military conditioning made refusing a direct suggestion from Harrison nearly impossible, regardless of her desire to remain anonymous. She took a deep breath and nodded, accepting that her quiet afternoon had taken an unexpected turn. All right, sir. What distance would you like to see? She asked the question professionally, slipping back into the mindset that had made her one of the military's most effective operators. The transformation was subtle but noticeable. Her posture straightened, her movements became more precise, and an aura of quiet confidence settled around her. Marcus and his friends gathered behind the firing line, eager to watch whatever demonstration was about to unfold. They positioned themselves like spectators at a sporting event, expecting to see decent shooting that they could later analyze and critique among themselves. Let's start with something reasonable, Harrison said with a slight smile. 25 meters, 10 rounds, standing unsupported. Then we'll see what else you remember. He knew Sarah's capabilities far exceeded what he was requesting, but he wanted to build up to a proper demonstration. Other shooters began to notice the gathering crowd and drifted over to watch. Word spread quietly through the range that something interesting was happening at lane 15. The range safety officer moved closer, curious about the demonstration that was drawing so much attention. Sarah moved to the firing line with fluid efficiency. She checked her pistol, loaded a fresh magazine, and adjusted her stance slightly. Her preparation was methodical but not rushed, each action flowing naturally into the next. Marcus noticed her grip looked different from what he'd been taught. Less aggressive, more controlled. "Whenever you're ready," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to observing military marksmanship tests under pressure. Sarah raised her pistol with smooth precision. Her stance was textbook perfect, but there was something beyond technique in her positioning, an almost supernatural stillness that spoke of countless hours under real combat conditions. She aligned her sights and began firing at a steady, measured pace. The first shot rang out clean and sharp. Through binoculars, observers could see the bullet hole appear in the center of the target's bullseye. The second shot followed 2 seconds later, punching through nearly the same location. By the fourth shot, Marcus's confident expression had shifted to puzzled concern. "Jesus," Danny whispered. "She's putting them all in the same spot." Sarah continued firing with mechanical precision. Each shot was identical in timing, stance, and follow-through. Her breathing remained controlled, her grip consistent, her trigger finger moving with practiced smoothness. There was no wasted motion, no adjustment between shots. Just perfect repetition executed with almost machine-like accuracy. The 10th and final shot completed a group that could be covered by a quarter. At 25 meters with a service pistol standing unsupported, such accuracy was beyond what most recreational shooters could achieve from a bench rest with a rifle. The crowd that had gathered stood in stunned silence. Harrison nodded with satisfaction, unsurprised by the demonstration. "Not bad for someone who's gotten rusty," he commented dryly. "Though I remember you shooting tighter groups when it really mattered." Marcus stared at the target in disbelief. Everything he thought he knew about shooting had just been challenged by a quiet woman who looked like she belonged in an office rather than a combat zone. His friends were equally speechless, struggling to process what they'd witnessed. "How the hell did you do that?" Marcus finally managed to ask. His tone had lost all traces of condescension, replaced by genuine bewilderment and grudging respect. Sarah lowered her pistol and engaged the safety, maintaining proper muzzle discipline even with the demonstration complete. "Practice," she replied simply, offering no elaboration or boastfulness about her performance. The range safety officer approached with obvious admiration. "Ma'am, in 15 years working here, I've never seen shooting like that. Are you some kind of professional competitor?" Before Sarah could respond, Harrison stepped in with obvious pride in his former soldier. "Sergeant Mitchell was one of our most effective special operations personnel. She's seen more combat than most soldiers see in entire careers, and her marksmanship saved more lives than I can count." The revelation rippled through the gathered crowd. Special operations meant elite forces, the kind of soldiers whose exploits became legends within military circles. Marcus felt his worldview shifting as he realized the quiet woman he'd dismissed was everything he'd pretended to be and more. "Special operations?" Danny asked weakly. "Like actual spec ops, not just regular army?" Harrison's expression grew serious as he remembered some of Sarah's missions. Sergeant Mitchell completed 4 combat deployments in some of the most dangerous areas of operation. She was qualified as a designated marksman, close quarters battle specialist, and advanced tactical operator. Her record speaks for itself. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the attention and tried to deflect. "That was a different life, Colonel. I'm just a civilian now, trying to keep some basic skills sharp." She began collecting her brass casings, hoping to signal an end to the demonstration. But Marcus wasn't ready to let the moment pass. His initial mockery had transformed into genuine curiosity about techniques that so far exceeded his own abilities. "Could you maybe show us how you do it? I mean, what we just saw was incredible. I've been shooting for years and never came close to that kind of accuracy." The request put Sarah in a difficult position. Teaching would require explaining techniques developed through years of life-or-death situations, sharing knowledge that had been earned through experiences she preferred not to discuss. Yet refusing would seem rude after Marcus's change in attitude. Harrison sensed her hesitation and offered support. Sarah's always been generous with sharing knowledge when it might help fellow shooters improve their skills. "Maybe just a few basic principles?" His suggestion carried the weight of gentle command, encouraging her to overcome her reluctance. Other shooters had gathered around, drawn by curiosity about the extraordinary demonstration they'd witnessed. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in exactly the way she'd hoped to avoid, but surrounded by genuine interest rather than the dismissive assumptions she'd faced earlier. "I suppose I could cover a few fundamentals," she said reluctantly, recognizing that her cover was thoroughly blown. "But understand that what you saw comes from thousands of hours of practice under conditions none of us want to repeat." Sarah stood before the small group of shooters, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. These people were looking at her with expectations she wasn't sure she wanted to meet. The weight of their attention reminded her uncomfortably of mission briefings where lives hung on her expertise. "The most important thing to understand," she began slowly, "is that accuracy comes from eliminating variables, not from trying harder or using more force." She gestured toward Marcus's elaborate tactical setup. "All that gear means nothing if your fundamentals aren't solid." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that his expensive equipment hadn't translated into the performance he'd hoped for. "So what are the real fundamentals? I mean, I thought I knew them, but obviously I'm missing something major." Sarah picked up her pistol and demonstrated proper grip without loading it. "Grip consistency is everything. Same pressure, same hand placement, every single time. Most people change their grip slightly between shots without realizing it, which throws off everything else." She showed them her stance, which looked deceptively simple compared to Marcus's aggressive forward lean. "Balance and stability matter more than looking tactical. You want to be able to hold this position comfortably for extended periods without fatigue affecting your shooting." Danny raised his hand like a student in class. "What about all that stuff Marcus was saying about dominating the weapon? Showing it who's boss?" A brief smile crossed Sarah's face. "Weapons don't have feelings to hurt or egos to intimidate. They respond to physics and consistent technique. Fighting your gun is like fighting gravity. You'll lose every time." Harrison watched with approval as Sarah slipped into instructor mode. He'd seen her teach these same principles to elite soldiers in combat zones, and her ability to break down complex skills into understandable components had always impressed him. "Can you show us the breathing technique?" asked another shooter who'd joined the growing audience. "I read about it online, but seeing someone actually do it would help." Sarah nodded and raised her pistol toward the target. Natural respiratory pause. You don't hold your breath or force anything. Just fire during the natural pause between exhale and inhale. She demonstrated the timing without pulling the trigger, her pistol steady as stone during the brief pause. "That's it?" Marcus asked. "I've been trying to hold my breath for 10 seconds while I aim. Thought that was supposed to steady everything." "Holding your breath creates tension and oxygen debt," Sarah explained. "Both work against accuracy. Your body wants to breathe, and fighting that desire creates muscle tremors you can't control." The range safety officer had been listening intently and stepped forward.
"What about sight alignment?"
"I see a lot of shooters struggling with that." Sarah appreciated the question because it moved away from combat-specific techniques toward universal marksmanship principles. Perfect sight alignment matters less than consistent sight alignment. Better to use the same imperfect sight picture every time than to have perfect alignment that varies from shot to shot. She demonstrated with her unloaded pistol, showing how she aligned the sights the same way for every shot. Your brain learns to compensate for small errors if they're consistent. It can't adapt to random changes in technique. Marcus was taking mental notes, realizing how many misconceptions had been guiding his practice. "So when you fired those 10 shots, you were doing exactly the same thing 10 times in a row?" "Exactly the same thing 10 times in a row," Sarah confirmed. "Same grip, same stance, same sight picture, same trigger press, same follow-through. The only variable was time between shots, and even that was controlled." A younger shooter in the back of the group raised his voice. "How do you get to that level of consistency? I mean, that kind of repetition must take forever to develop." Sarah's expression grew distant for a moment, remembering training sessions that pushed far beyond normal human limits. "It takes as long as it takes. The military has ways of accelerating the process, but for civilian shooters it's about quality practice over years, not months." Harrison decided to add some context that might help the group understand Sarah's exceptional abilities. Sergeant Mitchell's training included scenarios where missing meant people died. That kind of pressure tends to focus the mind wonderfully on perfect technique. The casual mention of life or death situations sobered the group. These weren't just academic shooting principles. They were skills forged under the ultimate test of combat effectiveness. "Were you really in that many firefights?" Danny asked quietly. his earlier bravado completely gone. Sarah hesitated, uncomfortable with personal questions about her service record. "I was deployed to areas where accurate shooting was frequently necessary," she said diplomatically. "The details aren't something I discuss." Marcus found himself genuinely humbled for the first time in years. His weekend tactical courses and shooting competitions suddenly seemed trivial compared to the real world. Application of these skills under combat. Conditions. "Is there anything we could practice here that would actually make a difference?" he asked sincerely. "I mean, I realize now I've been wasting time on the wrong things." Sarah considered the question carefully. These shooters were enthusiastic and willing to learn, but they lacked the foundation that military training provided. She needed to give them something practical without overwhelming them with advanced techniques. "Start with ball and dummy drill," she suggested. "Mix empty cases randomly with live rounds in your magazine. When you hit an empty case, any movement of your pistol shows flinching or poor trigger control. Fix that before worrying about anything else." The group nodded eagerly, finally receiving concrete advice they could implement immediately. Sarah began to warm up to her impromptu teaching role, remembering why she'd enjoyed training junior soldiers during her military career. "And slow down," she added. "I see too many people trying to shoot fast before they can shoot accurately. Speed comes naturally once accuracy becomes automatic. Rushing just builds bad habits that are harder to break later." Harrison checked his watch and realized they'd been talking for over an hour. The informal lesson had drawn more and more shooters, turning Sarah's quiet range session into an unexpected seminar on advanced marksmanship principles. The impromptu lesson had transformed the atmosphere at the range completely. Where an hour earlier Sarah had been an invisible presence barely worth acknowledging, she now found herself surrounded by shooters hungry for knowledge that could improve their skills. The change was both gratifying and overwhelming. "One more demonstration?" Harrison suggested with a knowing look. "I think these folks would benefit from seeing what real precision looks like under pressure." Sarah caught the subtle emphasis on pressure and understood what her former commander had in mind. He wanted to show the group not just accuracy, but the kind of performance that separated recreational shooters from combat-tested operators. "What did you have in mind, sir?" she asked, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. Harrison walked over to examine the range's target selection and found what he was looking for: a small adhesive dot, barely an inch in diameter. He placed it on a fresh target and sent it out to 50 meters, the maximum distance the indoor range allowed. 10 rounds, that dot. Same conditions as before, he announced to the gathered crowd. "But this time I want Marcus here to call random time intervals. Sarah shoots when he says shoot, not when she's ready." Marcus understood immediately that this would test far more than marksmanship. Shooting under time pressure imposed by someone else replicated the unpredictable stress of combat situations, where perfect conditions never existed. "Are you serious?" Danny whispered. "That dot's tiny and 50 meters is rifle distance, with time pressure on top of it?" Sarah felt the familiar calm descend that had carried her through countless dangerous situations. The chatter of the crowd faded into background noise as she focused on the task ahead. This was what she'd trained for, performing when performance mattered. She moved to the firing line and loaded a fresh magazine with practiced efficiency. The pistol felt natural in her hands again, like reconnecting with a part of herself she'd tried to leave behind. Her breathing slowed automatically as her mind shifted into the zone that had kept her alive through 4 combat deployments. "Whenever you're ready to start calling times," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the pressure of performing for an audience that now understood exactly who they were watching. Marcus looked nervous about his role in the demonstration. Calling shots for someone of Sarah's caliber felt like a huge responsibility. "Should I give you a few seconds between each shot, or however you want to do it?" Sarah replied. "Random intervals, rapid fire, whatever seems appropriate. I'll adapt." Harrison smiled at her response, remembering countless situations where Sarah had adapted to impossible circumstances with exactly that kind of calm confidence. Her ability to perform under unpredictable pressure had made her invaluable in special operations. "First shot," Marcus called out after a brief pause. Sarah raised her pistol smoothly and fired without hesitation. The bullet struck the small dot dead center. She lowered the pistol slightly and waited for the next command, her breathing remaining controlled and steady. Second shot now, another perfect hit, slightly overlapping the first hole. The group watched in fascination as Sarah demonstrated the kind of shooting they'd only seen in movies. Except this was real and happening right in front of them. Marcus called the remaining 8 shots at irregular intervals. Sometimes rapid fire, sometimes with longer pauses designed to test her ability to maintain focus. Sarah responded to each command with machine-like precision, never rushing, never hesitating, simply executing perfect technique regardless of timing. When the final shot was fired, the target showed 10 holes clustered within the 1-inch dot at 50 meters. Under time pressure, with a handgun, while being observed by a crowd of skeptical witnesses who were no longer skeptical about anything, the range fell completely silent. Even Harrison, who had witnessed Sarah's shooting many times before, was impressed by the demonstration. The combination of distance, precision, and pressure would have challenged Olympic-level competitors. Yet Sarah had made it look routine. "Holy shit," someone whispered from the back of the crowd, immediately followed by embarrassed apologies for the profanity. Marcus stared at the target through binoculars, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that in my life. That's not human-level shooting." "Yes, it is," Harrison corrected firmly. "It's what human-level shooting looks like when someone has dedicated their life to mastering the craft under the most demanding conditions possible." Sergeant Mitchell earned every bit of that skill through sacrifice most people can't imagine. Sarah holstered her pistol and began collecting her equipment, hoping to end the demonstration before it went any further. The attention was becoming uncomfortable, and she could see people starting to take photos and videos with their phones. "Could we maybe not post this online?" she asked quietly. "I prefer to keep a low profile these days." The request prompted nods of understanding from the crowd. Several people who had been recording put their phones away out of respect for her privacy. Danny approached hesitantly, still processing what he'd witnessed. "I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "When you first came in, we made some pretty stupid assumptions. I'm sorry about that." Marcus stepped forward as well, his entire demeanor changed from the arrogant competitor he'd been earlier. "Same here. I thought I knew something about shooting, but watching you just completely redefined what's possible. Thank you for taking the time to teach us." Sarah accepted their apologies graciously, understanding that they'd learned something valuable about making assumptions based on appearances. Everyone's here to improve their skills and enjoy shooting sports. That's what matters. The range safety officer approached with obvious respect and admiration. "Ma'am, I hope you'll consider coming back regularly. Having someone with your expertise around would benefit everyone who shoots here." "I'll probably be back," Sarah admitted. "It's a nice facility and I need to stay current with my training." She paused, looking around at the faces that had changed from dismissive to respectful. "Maybe I could help with some informal instruction now and then." Harrison beamed with pride at hearing Sarah consider sharing her knowledge with civilian shooters. "That would be outstanding. These folks could learn things from you they'll never get anywhere else." As the crowd began to disperse, many shooters approached Sarah individually to thank her for the impromptu lesson and ask if she'd be willing to provide more detailed instruction in the future. Her quiet afternoon at the range had evolved into something she hadn't expected, a chance to find new purpose in teaching others. As the crowd gradually dispersed and normal range activities resumed, Sarah found herself sitting at a bench with Colonel Harrison, watching other shooters practice with noticeably improved focus and technique. Word of her demonstration had spread throughout the facility, and she could feel curious glances from people who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. "You know," Harrison said thoughtfully, "what happened here today reminded me why I always believed you'd make an excellent instructor after your operational days were over." Sarah cleaned her pistol methodically, the familiar routine helping her process the unexpected turn her day had taken. "I never really considered teaching civilians, sir. Military instruction is different. You've got motivated students who understand the stakes. These people were motivated once they saw what was possible," Harrison pointed out. "That Marcus fellow went from cocky weekend warrior to genuinely humble student in the span of an hour. That's good teaching." Through the range's observation window, they could see Marcus and his friends practicing the ball and dummy drill Sarah had suggested. Their movements were slower and more deliberate than before, focusing on technique rather than trying to look impressive. "It's strange," Sarah mused. "For months I've been trying to figure out what comes next, what my purpose is supposed to be now. Today felt like the first time since leaving the service that I was doing something that actually mattered. Harrison nodded knowingly. He'd counseled many retiring soldiers through similar transitions, and finding new meaning after military service was one of the biggest challenges they faced. You've got skills that could help a lot of people, Sarah. Not just shooting, but leadership, teaching, mentoring. The range manager, a woman named Carol who'd been watching from the office, approached their table with obvious excitement. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Would you be interested in teaching some formal classes here? We've been looking for qualified instructors, and after what I saw today, I think you'd be perfect." Sarah looked surprised by the offer. "I don't have any civilian teaching certifications. My experience is all military-based." "We can help you get the certifications," Carol assured her. "The NRA instructor credentials, range safety officer training, whatever you need. What you demonstrated today is exactly what our customers are looking for, real expertise from someone who's actually used these skills in the field." Sarah felt a flutter of possibility she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Teaching had always been one of her favorite aspects of military service, working with junior soldiers and helping them develop into competent operators. The idea of doing something similar in civilian life was appealing. "What kind of classes were you thinking about?" she asked, genuine interest creeping into her voice. Carol's enthusiasm was infectious.
Basic marksmanship fundamentals, advanced precision shooting, maybe some tactical applications for law enforcement officers.
"We get a lot of police and security personnel who could benefit from your level of expertise." Harrison leaned forward, clearly supportive of the direction the conversation was taking. "Sarah, you could make a real difference here. Help people develop skills that might save their lives someday, whether they're law enforcement, military, or just citizens who want to be prepared." The idea was growing more attractive by the minute. Sarah had struggled with feeling purposeless since her transition to civilian life, and teaching offered a way to use her hard-earned skills for something meaningful beyond her own survival. "I'd need to think about it," she said carefully. "It's a big change from what I've been planning." "Of course," Carol replied, "but the offer stands whenever you're ready. In the meantime, would you consider doing some informal sessions, maybe once a week, helping people with fundamentals? We could start small and see how it goes." Marcus appeared at their table, having finished his practice session. His entire demeanor had changed from the arrogant show-off of earlier in the day to someone genuinely humbled by the experience of meeting a true expert. "Sorry to interrupt," he said respectfully. "I just wanted to say thank you again. That lesson changed everything I thought I knew about shooting. If you ever do decide to teach classes here, sign me up first." Danny and the other members of Marcus's group nodded agreement from nearby. "Same here," Danny added. "I've learned more in the last 2 hours than in the previous 2 years." Sarah found herself moved by their sincerity. These weren't just people looking for entertainment or trying to feed their egos. They were genuinely interested in improving their skills and understanding the principles behind effective marksmanship. "If I did teach here," she said slowly, "it would be serious instruction. No shortcuts, no ego boosting, just hard work on fundamentals until they become automatic." "That's exactly what we need," Marcus replied immediately. "I realize now that all my fancy gear and tactical fantasies were just covering up the fact that I couldn't shoot worth a damn when it really counted." Harrison smiled at the exchange, remembering his own early days learning from grizzled sergeants who'd cared more about competence than comfort. "Sounds like you've got your first students already lined up." As the afternoon wore on, several other shooters approached to express interest in potential classes. Word continued to spread about Sarah's demonstration, and people who hadn't been present were asking detailed questions about what they'd missed. The range safety officer joined their conversation, adding his perspective as someone who saw hundreds of shooters every week. "Ma'am, I've been working here for 15 years, and I can tell you that most people plateau pretty quickly. They hit a certain level and stay there because they don't know how to improve. You could help them break through those barriers." Sarah looked around the range with new eyes, seeing potential students instead of just casual shooters. Many showed obvious dedication and enthusiasm, but lacked the technical knowledge to reach their potential. With proper instruction, they could become significantly better shooters and, more importantly, safer gun handlers. "All right," she said finally, decision crystallizing. "Let's try some informal sessions first. See how it goes, whether there's really demand for this kind of instruction." Carol practically beamed with excitement. "Wonderful. When would you like to start? We could announce it in our newsletter, put up some flyers." Next Saturday afternoon, Sarah decided. Basic fundamentals class. Limited to 8 students so I can give everyone individual attention. Harrison stood up with obvious satisfaction. Outstanding. I think you're going to find this more rewarding than you expect. He paused, his expression growing more serious. And Sarah? Don't underestimate the value of what you're offering. The skills you learned in the military aren't just about combat. They're about precision, discipline, and performing under pressure. Those lessons apply to a lot more than just shooting. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the front of Thunder Valley's classroom, looking out at 20 eager faces gathered for her advanced precision shooting course. What had started as informal weekend sessions had grown into a comprehensive program that drew students from hundreds of miles away. The transformation had been gradual but profound, both for her students and for herself. Marcus sat in the front row, no longer the boastful weekend warrior who dismissed her on that first day. His shooting had improved dramatically, but more importantly, his attitude had evolved from seeking validation to pursuing genuine competence. He'd become one of her most dedicated students and had even convinced his wife to take the basic fundamentals course. Today we're going to work on shooting from unconventional positions, Sarah announced, her confidence as an instructor now fully developed. You've all mastered the fundamentals from standard stances. Now we need to adapt those principles to real-world situations where perfect shooting positions aren't available. Danny raised his hand from the second row. Like shooting around cover or from awkward angles? Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The principles remain the same. Consistent grip, sight alignment, trigger control, follow-through. But the application becomes more challenging when you're working around obstacles or in compromised positions. The classroom portion of her courses had become as important as the live-fire exercises. Sarah had discovered that many civilian shooters lacked the theoretical foundation that military training provided, leading to gaps in understanding that limited their progress. Colonel Harrison entered the classroom quietly, taking a seat in the back. He'd become a regular visitor to Sarah's classes, partly to observe her teaching methods and partly because he enjoyed seeing her thrive in her new role. The transformation from reluctant civilian to passionate instructor had been remarkable to witness. Before we head to the range, Sarah continued, let's review the mental aspects of precision shooting. What's the most important factor in maintaining accuracy under stress? A newer student named Jennifer, a local police officer, answered confidently. Breathing control and consistent routine. Don't let external pressure change your fundamentals, Sarah nodded approvingly. Jennifer had started the course barely able to qualify with her duty weapon and now consistently shot expert scores. More importantly, she'd gained confidence that showed in her patrol work and interactions with other officers. Correct. Stress makes people rush and rushing breaks down technique. Better to shoot slower and hit your target than to shoot fast and miss. Sarah had learned that this lesson applied far beyond. Marksmanship, patience, and persistence produced better results in most areas of life. As they moved to the range, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that afternoon, when she'd tried to remain invisible. Teaching had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't expected to find outside military service. These students weren't just learning to shoot better. They were developing confidence, discipline, and mental toughness that improved their lives in countless ways. The range session focused on shooting from barricade positions, using the facility's specially designed obstacles to simulate real-world cover scenarios. Sarah moved between students, offering individual corrections and encouragement. Her teaching style had evolved to emphasize patient repetition, rather than the intensive pressure of military training. Remember, the barricade is support, not a crutch, she called out as students practiced shooting around a concrete barrier. Use it to stabilize your position, but don't depend on it completely. Marcus was struggling with a particular position that required shooting with his support hand. Sarah worked with him individually, breaking down the technique into manageable components. His frustration was obvious, but his willingness to keep trying showed how much he'd grown since their first encounter. This is harder than it looks, he admitted, lowering his pistol after another imperfect group. Everything worthwhile is harder than it looks, Sarah replied. That's why we practice. 6 months ago, you couldn't hit a paper plate at 7 yards. Now you're working on advanced techniques that most shooters never attempt. During the break, Harrison approached Sarah with obvious pride. I have to say, watching you teach has been one of the highlights of my retirement. You found your calling here, Sarah smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. It feels right, sir. These people remind me why I loved working with junior soldiers. They're eager to learn and willing to put in the work. Any regrets about leaving the military? Harrison asked, though he could see the answer in her expression. Not anymore, Sarah replied honestly. I thought I was leaving everything behind, but I was really just transitioning to a different way of serving. These students depend on me to help them improve, to keep them safe, to build their confidence. It's not that different from what we did overseas. The afternoon session concluded with each student successfully completing the barricade course. Sarah watched with satisfaction as people who'd started as recreational shooters demonstrated techniques that would serve them well in any high-stress situation requiring precise marksmanship as students packed up their gear and said their goodbyes. Many stopped to thank Sarah personally. The gratitude was genuine and heartfelt. These weren't just customers satisfied with a service, but people whose lives had been genuinely improved by her instruction. Jennifer lingered after the others had left. Sarah, I wanted you to know that your classes probably saved my career. I was considering leaving police work because I felt so incompetent with my weapon. Now I feel confident and capable. Thank you. After everyone had gone, Sarah stood alone on the range, looking out at the targets that bore evidence of her students' progress. The quiet woman who'd tried to remain invisible had become someone others looked to for guidance and expertise. She'd found her place in civilian life not by abandoning her military skills, but by adapting them to serve a new mission. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Carol. Sarah, got a call from a federal agency asking about advanced training for their personnel. Interested in taking on some government contract work? Your reputation is spreading. Sarah smiled as she read the message. The journey that had started with mockery and dismissal had led to recognition and respect from the very community she'd been reluctant to engage with. Sometimes the best way forward was to stop trying to leave the past behind and instead find new ways to honor it. She typed back, definitely interested. Let's discuss details tomorrow. As she walked to her car, Sarah felt the satisfaction of a day well spent. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to make a difference. The quiet woman at the range had found her voice, and people were listening.